Mr. Brad Stevenson from Tennessee, state of Tennessee, Department of Environment and Conservation, TDAC. Brad has a bachelor's degree with honors in natural resources, geology and forestry from the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee, and also a master's degree in geography from Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. He has 25 years of experience in environmental consulting before he joined TDAC in 2016. He managed the investigation and remediation of hazardous waste sites under CERCLA and RCRA for private sector and government clients, particularly in karst areas, which is the condition that our Oak Ridge site is under. Since 1994, he served on organization committees of the Multidisciplinary Conference on Sinkholes and the Engineering and Environmental Impact of Karst, and served as a co-editor for 3 proceedings and volumes. He currently is working with TDAC's Division of Remediation Office in Oak Ridge, while DOE, EPA, and TDAC partner to clean up legacy contamination under FFA. And he has lived and worked in Oak Ridge since '94, but still relatively is new to working with DOE. But nevertheless, he's not shy to share with us his perspective working in that area. So we gave Brad only 15 minutes just to start the dialogue in this meeting, but I'm looking forward to working with Brad a little more closely, potentially perhaps as a member of the steering committee going forward. So welcome.
Thank you. Am I on? Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you, Ming. I really do appreciate the efforts of Ming and Kent and others that have helped put this meeting together, the whole steering committee. Appreciate you involving the states and other regulators. It's been a very educational experience for us. I will try to keep this brief. I've already shortened the presentation once, so you can thank Ming for helping with that. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, we're looking, DOE in Oak Ridge Office of Environmental Management is looking to get approval under CERCLA for a second mixed waste disposal facility in Oak Ridge for the disposal of CERCLA generated waste from cleanup. The current facility, EMWMF, Environmental Waste Management Facility, has largely been filled with waste from the cleanup of the former gaseous diffusion plant that you may know of as K25, now East Tennessee Technology Park. The proposed new facility is geared largely toward cleanup waste from Y12 National Security Complex and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So looking at potentially some pretty significant changes in the waste streams going there. Where we are now, I'm going to really kind of focus on 2 alternatives that were looked at in the RIFS process, the proposed plan, and really primarily the preferred alternative, which is on-site disposal at a particular location. But really at this point I'm going to be kind of contrasting off-site disposal, on-site disposal, and really focusing on the state's key concerns with the preferred alternative at this point. Just a real quick overview. We're in East Tennessee. We're in the Valley and Ridge province, so you'll notice that one of the inset maps there is kind of rotated about 45 degrees from the others. That's the trend of the topography in this area. The valleys and ridges trend northeast to southwest. So the maps I'll show subsequently will be oriented to what we call grid north in Oak Ridge, where north becomes northwest. So from here on, that's what you'll see. This is just an overview that shows a few of the sites in Bear Creek Valley that DOE evaluated in the CERCLA process. We'll be focusing on the ones in the center there, Central Bear Creek Valley site. There's really 3 different site configurations that were looked at there, but for the proposed plan, the preferred alternative looks at one that's called Site 7C, but we just generally call it CBCV, Central Bear Creek Valley site. Long-term history, DOE looking at the Oak Ridge Reservation, Bear Creek Valley was determined to be overall the most suitable geology on the reservation for waste disposal. Just a very quick geologic map. You'll see the existing facility over there on the east, the EMWMF, the proposed EMDF Central Bear Creek Valley sites. In a similar setting, you'll notice it's shifted a little bit up section or down the topography, so it's in slightly younger rocks, but conceptually they're very similar in that they're all dominated by fracture groundwater flow, fracture control flow that's oriented along the strike or along the trend of these valleys and ridges. One key point, one reason that we at the state considered this site worth evaluating was because it is a little bit isolated from the ridge by a topographic saddle, hoping that that might alleviate some of the water concerns for groundwater purposes. That's just a cross-sectional view. I won't really dwell on that, but you can basically assume that the rocks in this area are dipping on average about 45 degrees, or that's the angle that they slope into the ground. Just a quick topographic overview. In this one, you can sort of see that separation from the main ridge that I was talking about. I guess the key point, if I didn't mention it earlier, groundwater tends to flow preferentially along the strike or along this topographic trend. There is a component that flows down toward Bear Creek as well, but the recharge area for a given site like this is not simply just uphill from there, but it includes an area that may extend along the valley and along the ridge. That becomes a key point with some of our concerns that we'll get into briefly later on. Just a quick topographic overview of the proposed site. There's roughly 140 feet of relief on the footprint, and that red line is really just the footprint of the proposed waste cell itself. Doesn't include the berms and the support infrastructure. Overall topography relief here in this area is about 340 feet, including the top of the ridge, which is just off the top of the map there. This is a conceptual drawing. I believe this is from the proposed plan. Most of these figures, by the way, are from DOE documents, either the RIFS or the proposed plan. So this shows conceptually where some of the stormwater management facilities might go, rerouting of some roads and so forth. One of the concerns that we do have is maintaining a horizontal buffer around these facilities from the Maynardville limestone, which is our karstic unit in this area. Bear Creek flows along that karstic limestone layer, and in some places, sinks into the limestone, comes back out through springs, that type of thing. The actual footprint of the waste cell itself is on fractured shales primarily, although there are limestones interbedded with those as well. Just real quickly, kind of a background, how we got where we are. There were essentially 5 drafts of the RIFS over the period from, say, 2011 up till 2017. The state and EPA, for that matter, documented quite a few concerns with those documents that were expressed in comments. And we moved beyond those documents without formally approving them through a dispute resolution process that's part of our federal facility agreement, as I'm sure it is many others around the country. That dispute resolution agreement allowed moving forward to the proposed plan stage, and we spent about 2.5 months at the beginning of this year, from January up through early April, working collaboratively with DOE and EPA on developing a proposed plan. Basically, we also agreed as part of that dispute resolution agreement that the proposed plan would focus on the Central Bear Creek Valley site as the site that we would focus on for evaluating further. I'll get into a little more detail on that here in just a second. When the drafting of the proposed plan sort of came to a head last April-May timeframe, there were still issues when working collaboratively with the other agencies, we felt like we had sort of reached a point of diminishing returns, and there were still some issues that we didn't feel like were adequately captured in that plan. So we presented our state acceptance language to go into that proposed plan. Long story short, we had another dispute under the federal facility agreement, the resolution of which was that the language we submitted would be included in the proposed plan, and that plan could be issued to the public for review and comment, and that happened last September. And it's currently in the public domain for review and comment through December 10th as we speak. Just a very brief overview. The current facility that I mentioned earlier, the EMWMF, was approved essentially through a CERCLA process. At that time, as we were transitioning from DOE Order 5820 to 435.1, the CERCLA crosswalk option was largely used such that the CERCLA ROD, Record of Decision, functioned in effect as the disposal authorization statement for that facility. We took some lessons from that, and in the current facility, one of the things that we have agreed to with DOE is that the DOE 435 process would happen independently of the CERCLA process. So it is going through a full PACA review as we speak. Roger here is hoping to lead that effort. And similar to what Dib mentioned in the previous presentation, the state got agreement with the DOE that we would be allowed to observe that process. I'll jump ahead just briefly to say that there is not a CERCLA risk assessment at this point for this project, and therefore DOE is asking us to rely on that PACA process. So we have, through agreements, through these dispute resolution agreements, DOE is supporting our independent verification of that process. So we have subject matter experts. Many of you would know sitting here in the room with Neptune and Company who are helping us with that process. Let's see. So basically, I mentioned earlier, we went through 5 drafts of the RFS. There's also another document kind of in parallel with this that rolls into the RIFS, and that's this focused feasibility study for wastewater management. And that document, I won't say much about it other than it was to develop management, including discharge limits for the wastewater from the existing landfill and the proposed new one. That one is also under a formal dispute under the federal facility agreement that EPA initiated. That dispute is ongoing as we speak, so I won't say much about that. We'll see how that turns out here, hopefully in the near future. Then we talked about the proposed plan already. So under CERCLA, as you know, there are 9 decision criteria. And through the RIFS process, the state was primarily focused on protecting human health and the environment and compliance with the applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements, basically the laws. We're now down to the point where with the proposed plan, what's becoming more of our focus is the state and community acceptance of DOE's preferred alternative. That's just the regulatory basis for the state acceptance. Basically, we are required under CERCLA to share our position and key concerns, particularly as regards to any potential waivers of these requirements. Normally, in a proposed plan, by the time you get to that point, the state would pretty much be on board with, in this case, the lead agency, DOE, I'm sorry. This project has been a little different, as I mentioned, because we got to where we are through a series of agreements that basically defer resolution of a lot of our concerns and EPA's concerns to the future. So I'm just quickly going to list out here, I would say, probably hundreds of comments on the RIFS were really distilled down into 7 key concerns that are listed here, and I'll go through these briefly one by one. Site characterization. At the time we came to the agreement, the dispute resolution agreement on the RIFS, we really had no site-specific data for the preferred alternatives location, Central Bear Creek Valley site. The RFS was based largely on data from elsewhere within the valley. One of our key concerns was getting data from the Central Bear Creek Valley site, which DOE is working on at this time. This summer we received a first report, technical memorandum that had about 6 weeks worth of groundwater and surface water data in it. We reviewed that, and DOE is now working on collecting the rest of the 1 year of data that we considered sort of the bare minimum we needed from that site. Some of the siting criteria that we're working with basically require that you evaluate what's the historical high water table at that location. And sort of a bare minimum data set we're looking for is at least 1 year's worth that captures the highs and the lows. We probably came pretty close to seeing the high water level with the data we got from this spring, but probably not exactly. But that's where the other data up and down the valley can be used to help refine that and come to a better understanding of what we might expect that range of fluctuation to be. I guess I'll focus on that last bullet for this slide. Basically, our position at the state is that as those data come in, we have to evaluate that, and that might affect, our position on whether or not a revised proposed plan would be needed, or at a minimum, some revisions to this conceptual footprint of the site. One thing that I'll probably touch on a time or two is, we really want to keep the landfill footprint off of the streams. That's one lesson we've learned from the existing facility. We also want to keep the waste out of the groundwater, or it sounds like I'm saying the same thing, but we want to keep the groundwater out of the waste, and those are kind of two different things, but I'll explain that in a minute, perhaps. So based on that very preliminary data, now this is a TDEC generated figure. My colleague Beth Rowan generated this from DOE's data that came in from the 6-week period this spring, and the conceptual design that's in the RIFS. And basically this blue area is showing where it would appear that the groundwater level would be within the waste footprint of the proposed site. In general, the water levels that were measured in this preliminary data collection effort were substantially higher than projected or predicted in the RIFS. In at least one case, perhaps 35 feet higher than was assumed in the RIFS, which is incorporated into the proposed plan. Along with that, in some locations, we actually have strong upward gradients under the site based on the paired wells and piezometers that are there. Our concern there is that the DOE's hypothesis is that building the landfill, putting the liner in the cap, will reduce recharge sufficiently to lower the groundwater levels so that it won't be a problem. We'll have enough buffer underneath the waste, enough geologic buffer to keep the water out of the waste. Our concern is, though, based on where the recharge is actually coming from in these upward gradients, that hypothesis may not be supported by the data. The analogy I use sometimes with the general public is it's kind of like holding an umbrella over a ditch and expecting the water level to drop significantly in the ditch, just because it's raining. These are just 3 of the key anticipated waivers or exemption requests that DOE has stated in the proposed plan. We could expect to see. I won't really dwell on these a lot, except just to say that some of these are kind of near and dear to our hearts in terms of having a protective site. Some of these requirements are that the site shall not discharge groundwater to the surface, should be in areas of low to moderate relief, and not have hydraulic connection, and at least 50 feet above the historical high water table. Or I guess there's an option for 10 feet if you have a lower permeability geobuffer, but that's part of what we're evaluating with the data that we're getting now. Waste acceptance criteria really haven't been determined at this point. That's something else that DOE has committed to provide us before we're asked to sign a record of decision. There were some waste acceptance criteria proposed in various drafts of the RIFS, but in addition to the waste acceptance criteria, or the WAC for the radionuclides, which will come out of the DOE 435.1 process, the PA and the CA, which is a DOE area of authority. We're also concerned, for example, about the toxic effects of uranium, not just the carcinogenic effects. That's something that does not get evaluated through the PA-CA process. We're also concerned about mercury limits because Y12, as has been mentioned several times here earlier in the meeting, has a considerable amount of mercury associated with the buildings and the soils that will be cleaned up at that location. Just a quick example, and I know you probably can't read this from there. The key point is through various drafts of the RIFS, there were WAC values proposed, analytic WAC values. And part of what drives our concern about making sure we have a protective waste acceptance criteria are how much some of these values varied over time. For example, cesium-137, which has been talked about a lot here at the meeting, really didn't have a limit on the WAC in the first 4 drafts of the RIFS. Similarly, iodine-129, which again we've heard many times what a driver that can be, didn't have any real limits in the most recent draft of the RIFS. And some of the other parameters like plutonium, one of the isotopes there, had 7 orders of magnitude of range depending on which draft you looked at. Similar with technetium, I think 3 or 4 orders of magnitude. Uranium, again, we're concerned about the toxic effects, but just based on the radiological WAC that was proposed, values ranged in some cases so low that some of the natural shales in the area wouldn't be able to be disposed in the landfill. That was later determined to be a mistake. But it's those kind of things that give us some concern about how the WAC get developed and why we want independent verification of that process. I've already kind of mentioned that we're reviewing the PACA review process that will ultimately lead presumably to a preliminary DAS. I won't really dwell on that much more. Again, we do have independent verification ongoing of that effort, and we appreciate DOE's commitment to allow us to observe that process. It's been informative, and again, if we're going to be expected to rely on that, that's really kind of necessary for us to have a better understanding of how that's working. So we do appreciate that. One of our other key concerns is mercury disposal, as we mentioned. DOE documents indicate that that's the greatest single environmental threat on the Oak Ridge Reservation is actually the abundance of mercury. And one of our real concerns is complying with the Tennessee Water Quality Control Act in the discharges from the landfill, the proposed new one. Underdrains. The current facility, the EMWMF, has an underdrain that was installed essentially as a corrective measure in an attempt to correct groundwater level problems under that facility. We don't want to construct a new one with underdrains, quite simply. It's not consistent with our state policy. We sort of see them as bad if they work well because they have the potential to carry contamination directly to the streams. They're bad if they fail because it has the potential to raise groundwater back up into the waste area. So we really want to keep those out from under the waste area in particular. That's just a quick conceptual diagram from the RIFS of what an underdrain might look like. This is the proposed site where right now the conceptual drawing basically just has one under the berm on the southeast corner. There's also a diversion up here carrying a stream away from that area. But if I understand right, it's only about 10 or 12 feet deep, so we're not sure that will really intercept enough groundwater flow to solve some of the water level issues in that area. Just by way of contrast, one of the reasons we proposed looking at the Central Bear Creek Valley site and evaluating it further is that other sites like this East Bear Creek Valley site adjacent to the existing facility would rely much more heavily on an extensive underdrain network because it would cover more streams directly with the waste. Big concern for us. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, discharge limits for landfill wastewater. Our position is they need to be consistent with CERCLA. They need to be established in the record of decision, not later down the road as part of design. We really are focused on protecting people who eat fish in these streams. I forgot to mention earlier with the mercury, the fish in Bear Creek are already impaired by mercury levels that are too high. The stream's already posted to keep people from consuming fish from that stream. So we've got to be very careful, as we move forward with a new facility that we don't make that problem worse. And again, as I mentioned, the process for determining those discharge limits is part of a dispute that's ongoing that we'll see how that turns out. That's way above my pay grade. So again, just in summary, there are sort of 7 broad issues that are concerning the state at this point that we're working with DOE to resolve by the time we get to a record of decision. We look forward to working with them to find an effective waste disposal option to keep the CERCLA cleanups moving forward, including potential on-site disposal. Just a lot of details to work out of what that design would look like, what the waste acceptance criteria would look like, and so forth. I think the real debate, to put it bluntly, between us and DOE is where do you draw the line between what waste can stay on-site and be protective versus what goes off-site to one of the approved facilities out west, whether it's Utah, Nevada, or Texas, where you're in relatively flat, dry areas, with lower population and deeper groundwater, things that we're not blessed with in East Tennessee, where we get 4 to 5 feet of rain every year. Just the last slide here, I believe. We have Mostly, I've already said that, I think. We think there is a balance, that we can find a cost-effective waste disposal solution that includes some on-site disposal. We're not convinced that it's the current preferred alternative that includes 2.2 to 2.8 million cubic yards of waste that we really don't understand what that waste is yet to our satisfaction on that particular footprint. And there's a link there to on our website, on the TDEC website, where we've got the administrative record, circular administrative record, in an organized fashion. Most of the links there go back to DOE's site, but it just makes it easier for the public to find those documents, because as Dib said earlier, we're contacted by the public on a fairly regular basis wanting to know how to get more information that's leading to this decision.
The question about having the water table with the modeling below the waste cell, but obviously the measured data 35 feet above, what happened?
I'll have to defer that question to if anyone from DOE wants to answer that. Okay, Susan in the back. Susan's one of the lead authors on the RIFS and just joined us from Oak Ridge, which I appreciate.
First, I want to clarify as far as those water levels go. The highest one is actually 29 to 30 feet above what we projected. And one of the controlling wells is actually 12 feet below what we projected. So you can't just take one well and look at it for the whole site. But we are in the process of looking at preliminary design that will look very specifically at those water levels. And we'll also be looking at our model, calibrating it to those wells. But yes, when you lay the conceptual design on top of those water levels, there's a bit of an issue. But again, that's conceptual design. That was back in the RFS, and we're moving forward with preliminary design. We finally got CD1 approval in August, actually the end of August. So we weren't able to go ahead with preliminary design until just recently. So we'll be taking those water levels into account.
And one of the challenges that we face from the state, though, is that we're kind of stuck probably only with that conceptual design by the time we get to the record of decision. And
Right.
so that's one of our challenges.
Because the proposed plan is in comment with the public and so forth, we do not want to confuse things by